In 1967 at the University of Pennsylvania, two young researchers ran an experiment that produced one of the most quoted findings in the history of psychology. Then, decades later, they published a paper explaining that their own interpretation of it had been wrong for almost 50 years. In between, the theory was used to design an interrogation program. All three of those things are true, and most retellings only include the first. The experiment involved dogs and mild electric shock. One group could stop the shock by pressing a panel. A second group received exactly the same shocks, for exactly the same duration, but nothing they did made any difference. The only variable was control. Physically, the two groups had identical experiences. Afterwards, both groups were placed in a box where escape was easy. A low barrier separated a floor that shocked from a floor that did not. Step over, and it stops. The dogs from the first group did that almost immediately. The dogs from the second group, the ones whose earlier actions had never mattered, mostly lay down and took it. Roughly 2/3 never tried the barrier at all. Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer called this learned helplessness. The claim was that the animals had learned something abstract and portable, that their actions did not affect outcomes. And once learned, they carried it into a new situation where it was false. The escape was right there. They had stopped checking. The finding arrived at a moment when psychology badly wanted a mechanism for depression. The dominant behaviorist account struggled to explain a person who stops acting entirely, because behaviorism was built around the idea that behavior follows reinforcement. Here was an experimental procedure that reliably produced something that looked like depression, in an animal, on demand. Seligman extended the model to people, and the fit seemed remarkable. Depressed patients often describe exactly this, not sadness so much as the conviction that effort is pointless. The theory also explained why identical circumstances break one person and not another. What mattered was not the difficulty of the situation but whether the person believed their actions could change it. Then came a refinement that made the theory much more useful. Working with Lynn Abramson and John Teasdale, Seligman argued that what determines the damage is how a person explains a failure to themselves. Attribute it to something permanent, universal and internal, and helplessness follows. Attribute it to something temporary and specific, and it does not. That is the version most people have encountered without knowing its origin. It sits underneath decades of work on explanatory style, resilience training, and eventually the positive psychology movement Seligman founded. A single procedure involving dogs in 1967 became a general theory of why humans quit. In 2016, Meyer and Seligman published a review of what 50 years of neuroscience had revealed about their own experiment. Their conclusion was that the original interpretation had the logic backwards. The animals had not learned to be helpless. Passivity in the face of prolonged uncontrollable stress is what a nervous system does by default. It does not require learning. The work centered on a small brainstem structure, the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is a major source of serotonin. Under extended inescapable stress, this region becomes highly active, and that activity is associated with the passivity and withdrawals seen in the experiments. Interfering with it reduces the passivity. The default response to uncontrollable stress is to shut down. What the animals with a working escape panel had learned was the opposite thing. Detecting that your own actions change outcomes engages regions of the medial prefrontal cortex, which then dampens the brainstem stress response. Control is the thing that gets learned. It is an active signal sent from the front of the brain that inhibits shutting down. That reversal changes what the theory implies. Under the original story, helplessness is an acquired false belief, and the fix is to correct the belief. Under the corrected story, passivity is the baseline, and what has to be built and maintained is the detection of control. You are not removing something that was installed. You are supplying something that was never there. In December 2001, two psychologists who had worked for the United States Air Force Survival School, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, began advising the CIA on interrogation. Neither had experience conducting interrogations. What they had was familiarity with a body of theory about how to produce a state of total psychological compliance, and learned helplessness was at its center. The logic they applied was a direct inversion of the survival training they knew. That training taught captured personnel to find small areas of control in order to resist. Reverse it, and the goal becomes removing every trace of control from a detainee, so that nothing they do produces any predictable result, until they stop attempting to influence their situation at all. The Senate Intelligence Committee's 2014 report on the program describes the methods and the contractual arrangement in detail, including a company formed by the two psychologists that was paid tens of millions of dollars. The report's central finding was that the techniques did not produce reliable intelligence that could not have been obtained otherwise. Seligman has consistently stated that he did not design interrogation methods and did not know his work was being applied that way. He gave a lecture at a Navy survival school in 2002 on learned helplessness, at which Mitchell was present, and has said his subject was resilience and resistance to torture rather than its production. The American Psychological Association commissioned an independent review, published in 2015, examining the profession's institutional entanglement with the program. It is worth being precise about what the ethical problem here actually is, because the easy version is wrong. Seligman did not run a torture program. The problem is subtler and more common. A theory about how to break a mind is also, read backwards, a manual. Publishing the mechanism publishes both directions at once, and the researcher does not control which one gets used. There is a second problem, which is that the theory being used was the incorrect version. The interrogation logic was built on the idea that helplessness is taught, so it can be taught deliberately and thoroughly. The corrected neuroscience says passivity is a default the brain falls into under uncontrollable stress. The program was engineered on a misreading. That does not make it less harmful. If anything, it makes the outcome worse, because if shutdown is the nervous system's baseline response rather than a learned lesson, then producing it requires less sophistication than the designers believed and damages more than the belief they were targeting. And the corrected version quietly demolishes the popular self-help reading of the whole idea. If learned helplessness were only a mistaken belief, then the answer would be to think differently. If the passivity is a stress response that the front of the brain has to actively inhibit, then telling someone in that state to change their attitude is asking them to use the exact system the stress has suppressed. There is a result from this line of research that almost never gets quoted, and it is arguably the most useful thing to come out of the whole program. If an animal is first given experience with a situation it can control, and only afterwards exposed to uncontrollable stress, the shutdown largely does not happen. Prior control protects against later powerlessness. Researchers called it immunization, and the word is apt. The protection is not information. It is not that the animal knows escape is theoretically possible, because the animals that lay down on the electrified floor were in a box where escape was visible. The protection comes from having previously done something that worked, which appears to strengthen the prefrontal circuitry that later inhibits the shutdown response. The effect also runs the other way, and this is the part with real consequences. Exposure to uncontrollable stress early, before any experience of control has been established, produces effects that are more persistent and harder to reverse. Order matters. The same total amount of adversity does different damage depending on which came first. That gives a mechanism for something everyone observes and rarely explains. Two people meet the same crisis. One treats it as a problem and the other stops functioning, and the difference is not courage or character. It is whether their history contains enough demonstrated instances of their own actions mattering to keep the inhibitory system online when the pressure arrives. The practical implication points outward rather than inward. If what protects a nervous system is the detected experience of control, then the intervention is to arrange circumstances so that actions demonstrably produce results. Not encouragement. Evidence. Small, real, repeated proof that pressing the panel does something. This is why the effect shows up so reliably in situations organized around powerlessness rather than around hardship. Difficult work with visible results does not produce it. Moderate work where outcomes are arbitrary, decisions are made elsewhere, and effort is uncoupled from consequence does. The variable was never how hard the shock was. Both groups of dogs got the same shocks. It also explains the specific cruelty of systems that are unpredictable rather than harsh. A rule you can learn, however strict, leaves control intact. A rule that changes without pattern removes it. Inconsistency is not a milder form of severity. On this mechanism it is the more damaging one. 2/3 of those dogs lay on an electrified floor with an open door a step away. That image has been used for 50 years to argue that people who give up have learned something false about the world. The neuroscience says something harder. They had not learned to give up. They had simply stopped being shown that trying works, and that is the state a brain returns to on its own.